All right, let's take you back then to that conversation. Dr. Dave Mckinley joining us once again. It seems there'll be another legal battle between the Home Affairs Minister, Dr. Motsoaledi, and the Helen Suzman Foundation over the ZEP permits. Dr. Mckinley, you're still explaining to us the Helen Suzman Foundation saying that the minister must pay for the disdain of the matter, the way in which he's handling the ZEP court order. What's your analysis, your interpretation of how the minister has responded here?
Well, we think that the minister is being arrogant, and in the sense that basically he hasn't listened to what the court is saying. What the court said when they ruled against his cancellation of the ZEP was that he had not followed a constitutional process of participation and listening to different constituencies. And this is not something that is a choice of a minister. It is a law that we have. It's consistent with our Constitution, and they ruled, therefore, that his decision was constitutionally invalid. Now, if he's scoffing at that and saying he doesn't believe that they have any kind of case, well, he has the right to appeal. But I think his perspective in terms of the participation, which has been confirmed again and again by the Constitutional Court, is fundamentally problematic, whether it's him or any other minister. If the government shows that kind of contempt for their own constitution, which, by the way, the ruling party itself ushered in 1996, then we've got a problem.
Yeah. So what would that meaningful participation look like? Because the minister would say, well, we've now given yet another extension compared to the many that we have been given, at least in the last 15 years or so, for people to regularize and follow proper channels and apply for visas.
Well, the first thing is that it's not just a question of extension of a permit. It's the question of the documentation and how it is being managed. So many Zimbabweans and others, for that matter, but in this case, in the ZEP issue, would tell you that essentially that they have not been given any other when they have applied for work permits or they've applied for jobs, and they have not been given those because the Department of Home Affairs has become quite dysfunctional in issuing a whole range of permits. So it's not just the Zimbabweans, by the way. The Department of Home Affairs has got serious problems in work visas, skilled people's visas from overseas, student visas, a whole range of documentation. So we've got a crisis of documentation within the Department of Home Affairs, and they seem to be unwilling to admit that problem and to address that problem. So it's not simply a matter of an extension of a permit. It's how that permit is managed and how documentation is processed.
So the minister seemed to have a sense that NGOs in particular would want to, via the courts, disrupt him from enforcing immigration laws that have been established by his government.
Not at all. They're not trying to disrupt his ability to enforce anything. What they're basically saying is that this is not a question of enforcement of a law. It's a question of how you go about enforcing a law. So if you say that, you know, the police have a right to shoot to kill, as our Minister of Police, and a policeman goes and doesn't follow protocol and doesn't follow the proper procedures, there's going to be a problem. So the debate and the discussion mustn't revolve around people trying to interfere with the ability of the executive or ministers to implement the law. It's a question of how they're implementing the law, and we have necessary debate and discussion around that. And when our courts are the terrain on which some of these battles are fought, we've had very important interpretations of our law, where if the government had had its way in implementation, for example, in the secrecy bill, we would all be being spied upon, and we would have very little privacy. It's a good thing that we have courts to be able to review the decisions of the executive and ministers. That's what democracy is all about.
There is the human approach, there is a sensible approach, and there is an approach which, because of the various things that you can actually cite. One, if you were to look at illegal mining, the undertone of it is that it's because of the porous borders and the inability to enforce our migration laws. We've now seen 77 lives being lost, hijacked buildings. If you listen, the undertone of it again, there's this sense that they are undocumented citizens who come and they occupy these kind of buildings. And it is becoming almost a constant rhetoric within our political spaces from the various authorities. How do you navigate that line where you are trying to enforce the laws and the line of politicking to some extent that we are beginning to see?
Well, you have to ask the question, first of all, where's the source of the problem? So let's look at the Zama-Zamas and the illegal mining problem as an example. Or let's look at the dysfunctional urban settlement situation in the CBD of Johannesburg. It's not, if you just simply blame migrants for these things, what you're missing is fundamentally the other side of the equation. So, for example, in the context of the miners, the mines themselves have huge culpability in terms of turning a blind eye to these things, funding some of these syndicates, processing much of the illicit gold, politicians who are involved, private security who's involved, none of which, the legal mining would be impossible without the basic cooperation of many of these contexts. So what we have in the context of the inner city is officials that have turned a blind eye for 20 years to mafias that have taken over buildings. People are getting cuts in terms of some of the rents. We have many, many cases of corruption within the city council. And so you've got to look at this. If we simply adopt a discourse that says, like Trump does, or like the far right in Europe does, and say immigrants are the source of all of our problems. Now, when we look at Europe as South Africans and we say they're being racist, they're basically not looking at their own problems. But we don't look in the mirror and say the same things about ourselves in the context of how we're treating other migrants. So we need to look at the entirety of where the problem lies and address those instead of scapegoating poor and vulnerable people that oftentimes have been taken advantage of and who are desperate for jobs, who are desperate for other things. So if we have a dysfunctional immigration system, let's fix that. But let's not blame those that are the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. We surely, in our history of apartheid, have learned that lesson.
Where do you see this matter of the ZEP going? I mean, is there a point where there would be an amicable resolution to this?
I would hope so. I would hope that as a result of this lengthy legal battles that are taking place, that the DHA would do its job, essentially, which is start a process, say, okay, the court has indicated that we haven't done this properly. Let's do it properly and let's get it through. These are our views. This is what we think should happen. Put it out there openly and let people respond to it. Why this necessity of trying to go behind things and try to do them in shortcuts and try then when people criticize or say you haven't done the job properly, you label them as unpatriotic or you label them as foreign agents. And, it's very, very worrying. People should be worried because if we look at what's happening, for example, in the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill, which is being put in front of Parliament, there are elements of that which say these NGOs, some of these NGOs are against us and they're trying to prevent us from doing our jobs. We're going to allow the state security to vet them and to check them out. And what we've seen in many other countries with regards to that is that becomes a cover, oftentimes, for closing down critical voices and closing down those that expose corruption. So we must guard these freedoms very, very closely. People fought and died for them. We shouldn't politic about these things simply because elections are around the corner.
Dr. Dale Mckinley, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on
Thank
there.
you.
That is Dr. Dale Mckinley. He is a political activist, writer, and member of the coordinating committee for the Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia.